first sermon text is Psalm 80, verses 7 to 15. And I, as usual, forgot to look what page they're on in the Pew Bible. It's in the hymnal. It's in the hymnal. It's in the menu. It's in the bulletin. Somebody call out the page number. 520? All right, thank you. Psalm 80, verses 7 to 15. Restore us, O God of hosts. Let your face shine that we may be saved. You brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it. It took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. It sent out its branches to the sea and its shoots to the river. Why then have you broken down its walls, so that all who pass along the way pluck its fruit? The boar from the forest ravages it, and all that move in the field feed on it. Turn again, O God of hosts. Look down from heaven and see. Have regard for this vine, the stalk that your right hand planted. My second sermon text is missing. Boy, this is one of those days. So I'll have to do the odd thing and actually read it from the Bible. Which means I'll be squinting because I can't see. That's why I print it. Gosh almighty. Somebody call out the text. It's Isaiah
5.
All right. See, it takes teamwork. It takes a village to preach a sermon. Isaiah 5, 1 to 7. Yes. Isaiah 5, 1 to 7. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? This is God speaking now. When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and it shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. So ends the reading of these words inspired by God. May God grant us wisdom and courage for interpretation. Now, aren't y'all a bunch of gnarly-headed believers? And you know how I know? Because it takes one to know one. We are gnarly-headed. And I don't mean gnarly in the 80s sense of that's gnarly dude, or most excellent, or it's cool. I don't mean it in that 80s sense. I mean we are gnarly-headed as in bent, twisted, and contorted. We're like a certain kind of grapevine, which some vineyard keepers call gnarly-headed because of the way they're pruned and the way they're trained to grow. They're gnarly-headed. These are not gnarly-headed grapevines. I went to make sure. Now, I don't like to be told where to head in at. I don't like to be told where to go or what to do, especially when it comes to something as important as God and Christ and faith and church, and I'm pretty sure y'all don't like that either. But that tension between the impulse we have to use our own hearts and our own heads on our individual journeys of faith, the tension with that over against the ancient and present call of God to come together in community and to lean on one another, that tension is as old as our faith. It goes all the way back to Jesus, all the way back to Moses, all the way back even to Jacob, Isaac, and Abram, before he was called Abraham. Is this faith and covenant with God stuff mostly about me? or is it mostly about all of us together? In that ancient tug of war, I think we tend to pull toward it's mostly about me, not us, more often than not. I think that's going to be the legacy of American churches. Because that kind of religious independence, which sounds so American, pretty much started with us in the ancient history of the church, except for the Anabaptists and some really radical reformers during the Reformation. They marched away from Luther, they marched away from Zwingli, they marched away from Calvin. They did their own thing. But you know what? They created their own communities too, once they got out of that. Once they got out there. I think the theme song for the American church should be, or could be, when I survey the wondrous cross, rather than we are God's people, or what a friend we have in Jesus, or we are one in the Spirit. It takes both, I and thou, thee and me, at least two or three. We own up to that in our standard welcome. No matter who you are, nor where you are on life's journey, you're welcome here with us. But I can't help but think of myself first, and I bet you can't either most times. Going to the imagery in today's Bible passages, if we're grapevines, I think we're mostly gnarly-headed grapevines. That means we're old vines, set in our ways, and we're allowed to remain in our old ways. In a vineyard, a gnarly-headed vine is head-trained, not trellis-trained. Each vine grows its own gnarly head on its own, rather than growing together with others supported by a trellis, or a fence, or a line, a cord, or a cordon. There are advantages to that, to being a gnarly-headed vine. In a vineyard, gnarly-headed vines are stronger for having had to support themselves. But the grapes are smaller, and they're more pungent. They're more grapey. And there are fewer of them, because the plant has to spend so much energy just to stand. I think that's pretty much basic plant stuff, you know. A cotton plant that's real rank doesn't produce much cotton because the plant has used so much energy just being a plant that it doesn't have much fruit, and that's the point. Gnarly-headed vines don't produce much fruit. They produce good, strong fruit, but not very much of it. So I invite you to think about how we in this church, as vines in the vineyard that is church, how do we find support in structures like trellises? How are we in relationship with other churches, in communities with others, in the conference, and in the wider United Church of Christ? And how are we gnarly-headed? How are we headstrong? How are we set in our own individual ways and in this one church's way? How are we head-trained other than being trellis-trained with others in community? We're both. I just want us to think about that. Because pruning is the backstory behind the Bible stories about vineyards. Vineyard is a metaphor for the community of faith, for ancient Israel, for the earliest Jesus people, and for us in the churches now. And it's a great metaphor. The great metaphor doesn't just fall out of the sky. It's born in a community of people before anyone ever even says the word. I think a metaphor is noticed, or it's discovered. It's observed. It's not coined, and it's not made up. It becomes obvious. The connection between the image of the metaphor and the reality of the thing that it refers to, it just becomes plain. That's why vineyard is such a great metaphor for the community of God's people. As far back as anyone can tell, vineyards were critical to the well-being of ancient Israel, and were critical to the well-being of the society of first century Palestine in the New Testament times, in Jesus' time. Grapevines thrive in dry climates. The fruit is eaten fresh, or it's dried and stored for later. It was used to make sugar. It was used to make wine. What was the first thing Noah did after the flood? He planted a vineyard. That tells you how important vineyards were. Vineyards provided the food for the widows and the orphans and the travelers who could pick up behind harvest crews. The law said, Harvest crews couldn't take every grape or every grain of wheat. They had to leave something behind for the widows and the orphans and for travelers, for passers through. At harvest time, extended family and friends descended on households to help pick and tread grapes, otherwise the fruit would rot on the vines. Vine tending was considered to be more important than military service in defense of the community, because a vineyard was part of a family's inheritance, and it passed from generation to generation to generation. To maintain a vineyard then was to maintain peace and prosperity and social order and God's blessing and life. To lose a vineyard or to lose production from it was to lose the very promise of God, the very inheritance of God, which was what? The land and production from the land. That's how important vineyards were. That's why they're in the Bible as such powerful metaphors. So, we turn to today's readings. Isaiah 5 doesn't sound too promising. Here the prophets speak for God. God is displeased that the vineyard of God's people has quit producing good fruit. God says through the prophet, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and it shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. In other words, God is saying, you want to go it alone and do things your own way? Fine. Then I'll leave you to it, you gnarly-headed individualists. I will leave you to your own devices, and I will let nature take its course. No pruning, no hoeing, no protection. You want things your way, you old sour grapes, you got it. In the psalm, the author weeps. The vineyard has been trampled, the vines torn out, the fruit pilfered. Enemies had attacked God's people even as they remained faithful. They weren't being bad, they were being faithful. The vineyard suffered loss nonetheless, even as it faithfully remained a vineyard. The psalmist cries out to God, why then have you broken down its walls, so that all who pass along the way pluck its fruit? The boar from the forest ravages it, and all that move in the field feed on it. In Psalm 80, God's people of the vineyard had hope, yet they still suffered. The Assyrian Empire did attack. That's what he's worried about. In 722 BC, the Assyrians attacked, and the Assyrians took people captive. Yet the psalmist pleaded, restore us, O God of hosts, that we may be saved. You brought us out of Egypt. You drove all the nations out. You planted us here. You cleared the ground. We took deep root. We filled the land. The mountains were covered with the shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. Why then have you broken down its walls, so that all who pass by the way pluck its fruits? Turn again, O God of hosts, the psalmist is pleading. Turn again, God. Look down from heaven and see. Have regard for this vine, the stock that your right hand planted. The psalmist pleaded with God to no avail. Now, it's not clear from Psalm 80 because as a hymn, as a psalm, as liturgy, it's an expression of worship. But a big part of the problem with the people of God sometimes was that their worship was just fine, but their ethics weren't. They did good church, is how we would think of it, as far as it went. It just didn't go too far. At its worst, ancient Israel's well-being, despite its formal piety, despite the quality of its worship, it suffered because it failed to live up to the obligations of community outside of worship. What widows? What orphans? What travelers? What happens at the temple stays at the temple, and what happens in the world stays in the world. Or we might say, what happens at church stays at church, and what happens in the world stays in the world. The vineyard wasn't properly maintained. It fell into harm's way. Strangers ransacked it, not because God cursed it, but because God, as God does, left the people to their own devices, left the grapevines to go their own gnarly-headed way. With no one tending the vineyard, all who pass along the way pluck its fruit. All who pass along the way. And so, I would like for us to think, who is it that's passing along our way, plucking our fruit? And what, if anything, can we do about it? What can we do to get what we've inherited from God and from those who came before, represented by the old Bibles, represented by the new Bibles as we continue? What can we do to get us healthy enough to really sustain our vineyard? Do we need trellises? I think we do. Now, I'm fresh back from the annual conference, and I'm not going to beat you all over the head with it, I promise. But we're not alone. But we don't lean on the trellises of the conferences as much as we should. And we don't lean on the trellises of the United Church of Christ as much as we should. We're gnarly-headed. Do we have the energy for vines strong enough to stretch out into the community in new ways? We do stretch out into this community, but do we have the energy to stretch out in new ways? I don't know. If I lived closer, I'd be trying to strengthen our vines to extend right directly into Enid. And I mean with a presence of some kind, not just a trip into town and back. I'm just crazy enough to think that we could have a branch location in town. Get it? It's a branch. I have to say this. He is divine. We are the branches. But I'm serious enough, I'm crazy enough to think we could have a presence in town. And it could be something as simple as, could we carve out a corner booth and pick your restaurant and let it be known by word of mouth? You know what? We're going to be coming together there just to be there, just to talk God, just to talk God's love, and to talk about this church. Maybe people will walk by and pluck our fruit. Maybe they won't. But I'm crazy enough to think that that would be worth a try. I think we need to think about how we can extend our vines into the oil patch. I don't know how. Are there man camps anywhere around here? You know what a man camp is? It's where the workers stay. An old hotel might be one. There's a building in one of the towns west that was renovated especially to give people working in the oil patch a place to sleep. Any place you see a bunch of little travel trailers where people are obviously hanging out, those are man camps. There's a church in Kiowa that has found a way to reach out to the man camp that's close enough to it. And I don't know exactly how they're doing it. I met the minister at Wichita last week. We need to find out if there's some way that we can minister to those folks. Somebody should find out. Somebody needs to put heads and hearts together to create trellises and mutual support so we can act together in better and creative and unheard of and preposterous ways. Somebody needs to work to strengthen the Carrier Congregational Vineyard and get its vines to grow in places we haven't even thought of. Somebody and me. Me and somebody. Because I can't do it by myself. Restore us, O God of hosts. Let your face shine that we may be saved. You once brought a vine out to the Cherokee Strip and planted it in 1894. You cleared the ground for it, O God, and it took deep root and it filled the land. The plains were covered with the shade of the vineyard of this congregation. Homes and families were covered with its branches, and it sent out its branches to the farms and its shoots into town, into the next town. O God of hosts, show us what has broken down its walls. Show us how to restore this vineyard to its former strength. That doesn't mean numbers necessarily, but we need to find a way to strengthen. May we bow our gnarly heads, God. You know, we are forever learning to lean on Jesus, as the beautiful hymn says. In Christ, in one another as the body of Christ, there is more power than we've ever dreamed, as the hymn continues. Teach us again, O Lord, to lean. Amen.